The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Hello and welcome to Ask Claire on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. My name is Claire Hall, and I want to welcome you to edition number 4 of our program. And when Ralph Tycho, the producer of Comfortably Zoned Radio, asked me to join the network, I said, can I talk about anything I want? And he said anything and everything. So those of you who follow me on Facebook know that one of my great passions is baseball, and especially the history of baseball in the post-war decades. So today's guest has written about one of the most colorful and controversial figures of that era, and has a work in progress, and that would be Dick Allen, the Philadelphia slugger who also played for many other teams on the journey of his career. And then now a work in progress about Jim Bouton. So Mitch Nathanson is our guest. Good morning and welcome.
Well, good morning to you. Thanks for having me.
Okay, tell us a little bit about your background. I mean, and you've got a day job, obviously, as much as those of us who love to read and write books know you can't really make a full-time living at it. So tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do every day.
So I'm a law professor at Villanova, and I teach writing, sports law, and I try to work in baseball whenever I can, although that doesn't happen often enough. So that's I also supplement that by writing. So yeah, I've written this book about Allen, and now I'm working on one on Jim Bouton, and like you, it's a lot of fun to go back. But your interest and my interest are the same in that the post-war era, for me, is really the most interesting for me because there's so much change, and you can see that change through a lot of these figures, and so that's why I like to look at certain players and certain figures because you can see so much if you just if you look at them, you can see the larger picture while you're honing in on one guy or one person.
Interesting. Now, so Villanova, of course, is on the outskirts of Philadelphia. And can I ask, did you grow up a Phillies fan, and did that have anything to do with your interest in Dick Allen?
Yeah, well, I grew up in Central Jersey, in Trenton,
okay.
And I actually grew up in a neighborhood where the dividing line between Mets fans and Yankee fans and Phillies fans was right down my street, apparently, because there were some of us in our neighborhood were Phillies fans and some were Mets fans, and there weren't too many Yankee fans actually back then because this was the early 70s and the Yankees were pretty terrible. Even though my dad's from Brooklyn and he was always a New York fan, I became a Philadelphia fan for I don't know what reason. That's how these things happen, I guess. And I was a Phillies fan growing up, and I wasn't a huge Dick Allen fan. I mean, Dick Allen in Philly, his time in Philly where he was a star was before my time. I grew up in the early and mid-'70s, and by that point, he had left. He returned to Philadelphia in the mid-'70s, and I remember that. And one of the things that always struck me was I never understood there was so much hoopla surrounding his return. I didn't understand why there was so much, and so he interested me for that reason. That I didn't understand why he was such a big deal as compared to, all these other people that had come through Philadelphia. So that's really where the interest started, and that's why I ended up writing a book about it, really to figure out for myself what the big deal was.
Interesting. And the title of the book is God Almighty Hisself. Now, as soon as I saw the announcement of your book and I saw that title, I said, I bet this is going to be good. And I know where that title came from, but if we've got anybody listening who isn't familiar with it, please tell us where that comes from.
Yeah, so it's not. A lot of people think that that's something that Allen said, and it's not. It's something that was said about Allen. It was actually uttered by an interim manager. Allen had run-ins with Gene Mauch, who was the Phillies manager for a while, and then Bob Skinner took over for him, and then he resigned, and then interim manager George Myatt, I think that was his name. he took over, and this is at the end of Allen's time in Philadelphia, the first time in like 1969, and he had a press conference, and somebody asked him if he thought he could handle Dick Allen, and his response was, he was a Southern guy, and he says, "I don't believe God Almighty Hisself could handle Dick Allen. All I can do is try." So that's where the title comes from, and I thought it was apropos that it was said about him, because so many people use him as a conduit for other things when he himself he didn't say all that much, but people looked at him and used him and explained other things through him, some of which may have been there, some of which might not have been there. But I thought it was good that it was not a quote from him, that it was somebody else projecting something onto him, which was really the story of his career, is other people projecting things onto him.
Fascinating. And you said he didn't say much, and I'm sure in your research you looked at his autobiography, Crash, and I've never really seen an autobiography structured quite like that, switching between first-person and third-person narration, and his co-author essentially explaining that when he wanted Allen to talk about other players, he was very generous and expansive, but really couldn't get him to open up about himself very much. And your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's an interesting book. I love that book. I really enjoyed reading it because anything that Allen says is interesting. He does decide to say something. But, that's true. I mean, Whitaker, who I spoke to when I was doing this book, and I asked him about, working with Allen and what it was like and things like that, and he said it was not easy. And like you said, Allen will talk about some things but not about other things. And the way that book is structured, you're right, is interesting, and that part of it is Whitaker and part of it is, I guess, basically a transcription of what Allen said to Whitaker. It's interesting, but I thought, when you read it, you get Allen's take on a lot of things, but his take on a lot of things might be different than maybe what the record suggests or what other people say. And so the idea of my book was to try to give the story, tell the story more as I think it happened as opposed to how he perceived it. And so there are some things in his book which my book contradicts. Not because he's lying, but just because his view on a reporter once said, Dick Allen always speaks the truth as he sees it. The problem is he sees it differently 1 minute to the next, and which is true. So depending on what day or what moment you get him, he will give you his perspective on things, but it's a wildly shifting perspective, and it's hard to make sense of it. And so the big challenge of that book was to try to make sense of it. And so what I did was I spoke to a lot of people, and I also, luckily in that time period, Philadelphia had 3 daily newspapers. There were also daily newspapers that were from the suburbs. There were a lot of daily papers and a lot of writers covering Allen because the Phillies were pretty bad, and the only person really worth writing about was Allen. And so there's a lot of information about Allen. And if you piece it all together, you can kind of get the story. The only way the story that I have isn't right is if all of the sports writers are conspiring to make something up, which I don't think is very likely. So I think I got it to the extent that one could get something 50 years after the fact. But it's interesting. I mean, I also took a lot of time to talk about how Allen saw things. And why they may have been different from how they were written about, which in itself is interesting. Again, not because anybody's lying or trying to do anything nefarious. It's just different people have different agendas and perspectives, and the book is a lot about perspective. And I hope that what you get out of it or what somebody gets out of it when they read it is that so much is dependent upon where you're coming from. That really dictates what you see. And such is true with Dick Allen.
Oh, very, very much so. I came of age as a fan about the time that you did, and I remember, for many years wondering why he was such a figure of controversy, why he seemed to be so badly misunderstood. And, after reading your book, I said, now it all really starts to make sense. Here is this, strong, powerful African-American man. In demeanor, he's, say, the opposite of a Pete Rose, Mr. Hustle, Mr., friendly with fans, super friendly with teammates, loved by everybody, would play the game in the if he had to walk through a fire in a gasoline suit, all of that, versus Alan, who was really shy, a loner, although he did make friends with clubhouse crew, grounds crew. Seems like he was very well respected by his teammates, but almost it struck me that shyness was mistaken for aloofness among many other issues. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that he liked the game. He was good at it, obviously, but he didn't like all the stuff that came with it. And I think what he really didn't like were the expectations that came along with being a black player in that era, which were different than what you could say and do as a white player in that era, and that really bothered him. And I think, he was always a shy kid and a shy person growing up, but I think that what really rubbed him raw was this idea that Mickey Mantle could act one way, but Dick Allen had to act a different way. And, people always talked about, Allen wants, he wants a double standard. In which he would readily admit that. He would say, "Of course I do. I want the same double standard that Mickey Mantle has, and why shouldn't I have it?" To him, the double standard was the star gets treated better and differently than the rest of the players. But the double standard everybody else, was perceiving onto him was that he thinks that he should be treated differently, or this black player should be treated differently than the white players, or something like that. And that's not what he was saying. He was saying there's a double standard in baseball with regard to how white players and black players are treated, and he wanted to replace that with the double standard that he thought should be the norm, which is stars get covered by the they can get cover from the press for their misdeeds. They can kind of come and go as they want. Because that's what he saw. He saw other white players doing that, and that's what he wanted, and he couldn't understand why he wasn't allowed to do that. And, 50 years on, I think everybody would agree that he's right. But in 1966, nobody saw it that way, or very few people did see it that way.
Revolutionary stuff. Then after his time in Philadelphia ended, he spent a year in St. Louis, a year in Los Angeles, then he lands in the American League with the Chicago White Sox, and his manager is Chuck Tanner, who basically says he has 25 sets of rules for 25 players. And do you think that was really the key factor in Allen blossoming with the White Sox the way that he did?
Yeah, Tanner left him alone, and Tanner knew him growing up, which is another thing. So Tanner knew his family. He grew up in Newcastle, Pennsylvania, which is basically the county in which Allen grew up. And so Tanner was friendly with Allen's older brothers. He understood Allen, and he understood that the goal here is not to make sure that everybody gets to batting practice on time. The goal is to win baseball games, and it didn't really matter who went to batting practice. If you could still be the best hitter on your team, what do you need batting practice for? And again, today, we see that happens all the time. I mean, everybody has their own regimen and routine now in baseball, and nobody thinks twice about it. But back then, unless you were a star, you showed up at batting practice, and there were bed checks and all this other stuff. And Tanner was one of the first people to realize that was just nonsense, and you didn't need any of that. And if the players weren't playing well, you would step in, but why would you step in until that point? And so Allen thrived, at least for a time there. He wore out his welcome for a couple of years anyway.
So Allen's career came to an end in 1977, and yet his shadow still looms large in the game. You will find a lot of fans who think he is the most deserving player not in the Baseball Hall of Fame. Then on the other hand, there are people like Bill James, statistician and historian, who did a piece, what I think Allen's supporters consider kind of the ultimate hatchet job on Allen. And so, the debate still rages. He didn't come close to winning on the writer's ballot, yet the last time he was eligible in 2014, he fell short by just one vote. So I'd appreciate your take on the whole Hall of Fame issue for Allen and whether you think he's eventually going to make it.
Well, my personal opinion of this is that I think it's better to be the best player not in the Hall of Fame than the worst player in the Hall of Fame, right? You get more notoriety if you're not in, right? So his career is all about notoriety. He would not be the worst player in the Hall of Fame. He would actually be probably somewhere in the middle. My feeling about it is that a guy like him, it makes sense that he's not in the Hall of Fame. I mean, if he was accepted by the club, then it's no fun anymore. So I think that there's a lot of people in the Hall of Fame nobody talks about, right? Because they got in, and then who knows? You walk through the plaque gallery, and most people, they don't know 90% of these guys. But every time it comes up, Allen's name comes up. And so I think it's good for fans of Dick Allen that he's not in, because we're always talking about him. And so whether he gets in or not, for me, I think it's better that he doesn't get in. But does he deserve to get in? I mean, there are some guys you look at and you can't honestly say that, such and such a player was better than Dick Allen. I mean, there's not even an argument. And the funny thing is about Bill James, who is a very astute guy and a very smart guy. I love Bill James, but he is one of the forebearers of analytics, and yet Allen is one of the very few old-time players whose career looks better when you use advanced stats, right? Most of these guys, they had great baseball card numbers. They had good batting average, home runs, RBIs. But then, if we superimpose these analytics of today on them, like WAR and OPS and OPS plus and all that stuff, they don't look so great. Allen looks better. Allen's baseball card stats are like borderline Hall of Fame, but his advanced metrics are really very good. And I mean, his OPS plus, I think, is the same as Hank Aaron or Willie Mays. He's right with them.
I believe, right up there with them.
Yeah, and so he didn't have as many home runs as either of those two guys because he didn't play as long, which that's a consideration too. But I just think it's funny that of all people, Bill James is the guy who doesn't want him in, because by all rights, Bill James should be the first person to want him in, which is another odd thing. Yeah, it's another odd thing when it comes to Dick Allen's career.
Well, a great conversation about Dick Allen. How about if we move along to the subject of your book in progress, and that would be Jim Bouton, of course, known to every baseball fan, especially of a certain age, as the author of Ball 4. And when I saw your announcement that he was going to be your subject, my immediate thought was, like Dick Allen, certainly one of the true mavericks or nonconformists of the era. But unlike Dick Allen, who was, I think it's fair to say pretty reticent, pretty wary of the press, that Bouton freely talked with the press and wrote a lot, of course, not only in Ball 4, but subsequent books about his own life and career. So talk about, maybe, if you would, a little bit about what drew you to Bouton as a subject, and what unique statement you hope to be able to make about him.
Yeah, I think that in the 60s, I think the three people who had the biggest impact on baseball, I'm not saying these are the three best players, because they certainly were not, but the three players who had the biggest impact on baseball throughout that decade were Curt Flood, Dick Allen and Jim Bouton. And so I wrote about Allen, and there's a couple of really good Curt Flood books out there. So I think that area is pretty much taken. There is nothing on Jim Bouton, which is amazing. And part of the reason why there's nothing on Jim Bouton is because Jim Bouton, as you say, Jim Bouton himself has been so prolific writing that, you know, it can be a challenge to find your narrative place in his story because he is, you know, he has written so much and said so much himself. But, you know, I thought that he would be just fascinating to write about because he's just such a fascinating guy. And his opinions are interesting, and he's written his opinions. Everybody who follows Jim Bouton, who's read Ball 4, probably knows his opinions, but my idea was to try to place him within his era and talk about his impact and talk about, you know, how people reacted to him and how he and the effect he had on what he was writing about. And so that's the one thing that I can do that he can't do, right? He can only write his own perspective. He can't put himself in context. And so that was the idea behind this book, was to take a fascinating person and put him in context, in the proper historical context, because he's a huge figure. And besides that, he's just a lot of fun to write about, and he's just a very interesting guy. And so, you know, unlike Allen, who you couldn't get to talk, the thing with Bouton has always been, you know, a lot of people said, well, you couldn't get him to shut up, which as a writer is great, you know, because you never have a shortage of things to write about. So he's been a lot of fun to write about and read about these last couple of years.
Yes, indeed. And, you know, to refresh people, the very quick arc of his career: came up as a fastballer with the Yankees, had a couple of great seasons, hurt his arm, struggled to recover his career, finally resurrected it in Seattle, of all places, with the expansion 1969 Seattle Pilots, and so made that how can I put it charitably, rather ragtag assembly of players, coaches, and manager into something of a legend, thanks to Ball 4. Finished up with the Houston Astros, and then after a foray into television news, resurrected his career in 1975 with my hometown, Portland Mavericks, and ended up, you know, probably one of the most improbable quests of all, making it back to the big leagues at the end of 1978 with Ted Turner's Atlanta Braves. And any thoughts on any phase of that career that you find particularly interesting or, you know, able to mine for new insights?
Well, all of it is interesting. The thing that I thought, you know, he's been involved in so many different things. And, you know, the interesting thing about him, I thought, is that as smart as he is, and he's not just smart, he's really an inventive thinker. But, you know, a couple of things are required to get these ideas off the ground. And you have to hit the cultural moment at the right time. And if you don't, you can be the smartest guy in the world and something will fail. Doesn't mean you're not smart. Or doesn't mean you didn't have a great idea. It means you missed the moment, or the moment you were too soon for the moment. And I didn't realize this when I was starting out, but you know, now that I'm really well into it, I'm realizing that the thing that really marks his life is that there are occasions where he hit the moment, the cultural moment, and there are also plenty of moments where he was just too far ahead of the curve. And he missed on some ideas which subsequently have become huge things, which he thought of first, but he was just so far ahead of the curve that nobody else understood what he was talking about. And And he missed on those things. So we'll see, what did he hit? He hit the idea for a tell-all, really humanizing story of baseball. It had to be in the late 60s. It could not have come a decade earlier because people wouldn't have accepted it. It wouldn't. You could write it, sure, but nobody would have bought it at that point. And so he really hit the cultural moment. I mean, the thing that, you know, if you look at the bestseller list of 1970, you'll see there's a lot of books about sex. Portnoy's Complaint had come out the year before. And so there was this idea that, you know, a lot of things which were taboo, maybe even 5 years earlier, weren't taboo anymore. And so people were ready for Ball 4. When he left and he became a sportscaster, he hit this moment where the idea of the jock in the newsroom was just starting. And he hit that, and he was able to advance it. Keith Olbermann, who I spoke to for this book, says, you know, the whole Sports Center thing that Olbermann did in the 90s, that's his impression of Jim Bouton.
Wow.
And so he says, you know, if everybody talks about how Sports Center was revolutionary, go back 2 decades, watch Jim Bouton on Eyewitness News. That was the revolutionary thing. And Olbermann, who grew up in New York, watched him as a kid and basically patterned his Sports Center broadcast after what he saw Bouton do. And so, you know, that's when you hit a moment. But there are also things where, you know, he had a couple of ideas. He's also an inventor, and he has all sorts of ideas. And they're all interesting in their own way. Some of them were Big League Chew, was big success. But he also had an idea, an analytics-based baseball card in the early 70s, which didn't sell very well. Now, they were not the same advanced stats that we have today, but I have these cards, or it's a kind of like a slide card, and it shows you, if you put a certain batter against a certain pitcher, it shows you what he's most likely going to do, where he's most likely going to hit the ball, and it's not broken down as you would think from the early 70s. Well, a lefty will hit a right-hander this way or whatever. It's certain tendencies of certain hitters versus the tendencies of certain types of pitchers. That's analytics. But he's got that 3 decades before anybody is thinking analytics, and it didn't sell. Looking back on it, I mean, it's really prescient, you know, of what we're
yeah,
doing.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and he had that, and then he had an idea for a reality show many years before reality television started. He wanted to have a reality show where they follow a minor league team around, and they'd mic up the players, and they'd get into their personal lives and show them at home and everything like that. And he had trouble selling that because people would say, who cares about that? There's no script. There's no, what's the story? And his response was, the players are the story. The people are the story. It didn't sell. But a few years later, everything is reality television. And so he has a bunch of things like that where, you know, if you hit the cultural moment, it looks like a wonderful idea. But if you miss it, people look at you like you're crazy. And to me, that's really the story of his life. Like, sometimes he hit it, sometimes he wasn't behind it. He was way ahead of it.
Fascinating. And I know it's always risky to a degree to ask an author about his work in progress, but do you have a targeted publication date when we're going to be able to read your take on Jim Bouton?
Well, the goal, as you say, it's always risky to put a thing on this, but the goal, the hope, is that it'll be out in the spring of 2020, which is the golden anniversary of the release of Ball 4. And
perfect timing.
That would be perfect timing. Of course, we have to hit all those marks before that. So, but I have my fingers crossed that we will, and that will happen. Of course, you know, there's a lot of time between now and then, so anything can happen. But that's the goal, because I think that's when people are going to be. There are some people who are always thinking about Ball 4, as you know, but there are also people who haven't thought about it for a long time. But in 2020, they're going to be reminded of it because of that, the golden anniversary of that book. And it would probably be a good time for a biography of Jim Bouton, if that could happen. And so, fingers crossed, that's what the plan is.
Okay, well, pound the button, make that book happen, my friend. channeling Joe Schultz. Okay, any last thoughts before we sign off on Dick Allen, Jim Bouton, baseball, or life?
No, not really. I just find these people, these countercultural icons to be interesting. And so that's I guess why I'm drawn to them. Although I guess I will say one thing: neither Allen nor Bouton considers themselves countercultural, which I think is interesting.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, I mean, particularly not Bouton. He does not like it when you say that. He's like, I just, look, I've told these stories. They're funny stories. There's nothing countercultural about it. It's just, this is what I saw. This is what happened, and whatever. But he certainly is. Despite what his protestations to the contrary. He knows that, right? But it's interesting. I find that interesting that neither of these guys who really were countercultural in so many ways consider themselves to be regular guys. That's another thing that makes them interesting to me, I think.
Well, great. It has been great talking with you, Mitch Nathanson, our guest this week on Ask Claire, a law professor at Villanova University, author of God Almighty Hisself, a biography of Dick Allen, and also a forthcoming biography of Jim Bouton. Mitch, thanks again. And for Ask Claire, I am Claire Hall. Until next time, happy trails to you till we meet again.
This has been a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.